It was a quiet night in the sleepy suburb of Oakwood. The neon OPN sign in the window of Buttercream Bliss Bakery had been flickered off hours ago, signaling the end of another long day for owner Karen Perkins. Little did she know that a very uninvited guest was about to pay her a visit. The sound of shattering glass pierced the stillness as a figure in a long coat and oversized sunglasses clumsily climbed through the broken display window. With a thud, Karen landed on the pristine tile floor, surrounded by shards of glass and scattered crumbs from the pastry case. "I'm here to rescue the cupcakes," she shouted, her voice echoing through the empty bakery. Karen frantically surveyed the room, her eyes darting from tray to tray of freshly baked treats. Spotting a particularly tempting display of red velvet cupcakes, she snatched them up and stuffed them into her oversized purse. As she scurried around the counter, Karen knocked over a rack of muffins, sending them tumbling to the floor in a sugary explosion. "Those poor things must have been so scared, all alone in here," she muttered, shoving a few more cupcakes into her bag. Suddenly, the sound of sirens pierced the night air, growing louder with each passing second. Karen froze, the realization of what she had done dawning on her. She had broken into a private business and stolen its inventory. There was no escaping the consequences now. Clutching her purse full of cupcakes, Karen darted toward the back of the bakery, searching for a hiding place. She spotted a small supply closet and quickly squeezed herself inside, just as the front door burst open and a team of police officers swarmed the scene. "This is the police. Come out with your hands up," a gruff voice commanded. Karen held her breath, praying the officers wouldn't find her. She could hear their footsteps echoing through the bakery as they searched for the intruder. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of the officers began to fade. Karen carefully cracked open the closet door, peeking out to see if the coast was clear. To her horror, a pair of uniformed legs came into view, and a large hand grabbed the door, yanking it open. Well, look what we have here," the officer said, his eyes narrowing as he looked down at Karen cowering in the closet, surrounded by crumbs and cupcake wrappers. "You're coming with us, ma'am." As Karen was led out of the bakery in handcuffs, the morning sun began to peek over the horizon. She had thought she was rescuing the poor, abandoned cupcakes, but now it was her own freedom that needed saving. The jailhouse echoed with the sound of Karen's incessant wailing as she was processed and booked for breaking and entering. Despite her pleas of, "I was just trying to save the cupcakes," the officers showed no sympathy. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for burglary and theft. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," the lead officer said sternly, fingerprinting and photographing a defiant Karen. As she was led to a holding cell, Karen caught a glimpse of herself in the mirrored glass. Her once meticulously styled hair was now disheveled, and her designer outfit was wrinkled and dusted with crumbs. This was not how her night was supposed to go. "This is all a big misunderstanding," she cried, grasping the bars of the cell. "Those cupcakes were in danger, and I had to save them." The officer on duty simply rolled his eyes. "Sure, lady. That's what they all say." Fuming, Karen paced the small cell, muttering under her breath. How dare they arrest her for trying to do a good deed? Didn't they understand she was the hero here, rescuing those poor, abandoned cupcakes? Hours passed, and Karen's outrage only grew. She had always prided herself on being a model citizen, one who always did the right thing. Yet here she was, locked up like a common criminal. It was simply unacceptable. As the sun rose, Karen was finally summoned to see the judge. Straightening her rumpled clothes, she tried to regain some semblance of composure. She would show them all that she was no ordinary lawbreaker. She was a woman on a mission, a crusader for the cupcakes. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Wilkins," the bailiff announced, and Karen stood tall, ready to plead her case. "Miss Perkins, you stand accused of breaking and entering, as well as theft. How do you plead?" the judge asked, peering at her over the rim of his glasses. Karen took a deep breath, her chin held high. Not guilty, Your Honor. I was simply trying to rescue those poor cupcakes from the cold, empty bakery. They were in danger of going stale or being thrown away. The judge looked at her, bewildered. Ma'am, the bakery was closed for the night. There was no immediate threat to the cupcakes. But don't you understand? Karen cried, her composure crumbling. I had to save them. Those cupcakes needed me. As the judge shook his head and began to deliver his verdict, Karen realized that her noble intentions had landed her in a world of trouble. The sweet taste of her heroism had turned bitterly sour. The judge's gavel came down with a resounding thud, silencing the courtroom. Ms. Perkins, I find you guilty of breaking and entering, as well as theft. Your actions, while misguided, caused significant damage to the Buttercream Bliss Bakery. I sentence you to 6 months in county jail and a fine of $5,000. Karen's jaw dropped in disbelief as the weight of the judge's words sank in. 6 months in jail? A $5,000 fine? This couldn't be happening. She was supposed to be the hero, not the villain. But Your Honor, you don't understand, she pleaded, desperation creeping into her voice. I was just trying to save those poor cupcakes. They were all alone, and I couldn't bear the thought of them going to waste. The judge shook his head, unswayed by her impassioned pleas. The law does not recognize cupcake rescue as a valid defense, Ms. Perkins. You broke the law, and you must face the consequences. As the bailiff moved to escort Karen out of the courtroom, she suddenly felt a stinking realization. This wasn't just about the cupcakes anymore. This was about her own sense of entitlement and reckless disregard for the rules. She had truly believed that her good intentions would absolve her of any wrongdoing, but the justice system had swiftly and mercilessly proven her wrong. The ride to the county jail was a silent one, save for the occasional sniffle from Karen. She stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of her neighborhood pass by, knowing that for the next 6 months this would no longer be her reality. Her once pristine reputation lay in tatters, and the weight of her mistakes was a bitter pill to swallow. When the jail doors clanged shut behind her, Karen finally allowed the tears to flow freely. She had never imagined that her quest to save the cupcakes would land her in such a dire predicament. The sweet fantasy of heroism had turned into a nightmare of harsh consequences. As she was led to her cell, Karen couldn't help but wonder how her family and friends would react to the news of her arrest. The shame and embarrassment threatened to consume her, and she found herself longing for the comfort of her cozy home and the familiar scent of freshly baked pastries. In the solitude of her cell, Karen had no choice but to confront the harsh truth. Her sense of entitlement and disregard for the law had led her down a path of self-destruction. The cupcakes were long gone, and all she had left were the bitter memories of her foolish crusade. Time seemed to crawl by as Karen served out her sentence in the county jail. Each day blurred into the next, punctuated only by the monotony of her routine and the occasional visit from her bewildered family. Her husband, Michael, had been the first to arrive, his face a mix of concern and disappointment. Karen, what on earth were you thinking? He had asked, shaking his head. Breaking into a bakery, stealing cupcakes. This isn't like you at all. Karen had tried to explain her rationale, her voice trembling with desperation. You don't understand, Michael. I had to save those cupcakes. They were in danger of being thrown away. But her husband had simply sighed, the light in his eyes dimming. You need to take responsibility for your actions, Karen. This isn't going to be easy to fix. As the weeks passed, Karen's once vibrant social circle began to distance themselves. The news of her arrest had spread like wildfire through their small community, and she was quickly becoming the subject of whispered gossip and judgment. Even her closest friends, the ones she had once considered her loyal confidants, avoided her calls and declined her pleas for visits. The once adoring Karen Perkins fan club had dissolved, leaving her feeling more isolated than ever before. The monotony of jail life only exacerbated her sense of loneliness and despair. She spent her days staring at the gray walls of her cell, haunted by the memories of her once comfortable existence. The scent of freshly baked goods had been replaced by the stale aroma of institutional meals, and the familiar hum of the bakery's ovens had been silenced by the echoing clangs of metal bars. As the months ticked by, Karen's resolve began to crumble. She had always prided herself on being in control, on having it all figured out. But now, stripped of her freedom and her reputation, she was forced to confront the harsh reality that her sense of entitlement had led her down a path of self-destruction. Finally, the day of her release arrived, and Karen emerged from the jailhouse, blinking in the bright sunlight. She had expected a hero's welcome, or at the very least, a sympathetic embrace from her loved ones. Instead, she was met with a cold, indifferent silence. As she made her way back to the once familiar streets of her neighborhood, Karen realized that the cupcakes she had tried so desperately to save were the least of her concerns. The true challenge now lay in rebuilding the shattered pieces of her life and regaining the trust she had so carelessly squandered. The months of isolation in jail had done little to temper Karen's sense of entitlement and misguided self-righteousness. As she stepped out into the world, she was determined to reclaim her former life, convinced that her friends and neighbors would welcome her back with open arms. However, the reality that greeted her was far from the fantasy she had concocted in her mind. The once bustling streets of her neighborhood felt eerily silent, and the familiar faces of her acquaintances quickly averted their gaze as she passed by. Undeterred, Karen marched straight to the door of her closest friend, Samantha, ready to demand an explanation for the cold shoulder. But before she could even raise her hand to knock, the door swung open, revealing a tense-faced Samantha. "Karen," Samantha said, her voice laced with a mixture of pity and disdain. I didn't expect to see you back so soon." Karen straightened her shoulders, determined to reclaim her former status. "Samantha, darling, it's so good to see you. I've missed our weekly coffee dates terribly. Why don't you invite me in so we can catch up?" But Samantha's expression remained steadfast, her body language clearly signaling her discomfort. "I don't think that's a good idea, Karen. Things have been different since you've been gone." Karen's brow furrowed in confusion, her carefully crafted smile faltering. "What do you mean, different? I'm still the same old Karen, just a little worse for wear. Come on, let me in, and we can talk about it over some pastries." Samantha's eyes darted away, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the doorknob. "I'm sorry, Karen, but I don't think that's a good idea. The whole town's been talking, and, well, I just don't think it's the best time for us to get together. Maybe in a few months, once the dust has settled." Karen's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and indignation. "The dust has settled. What are you talking about? I paid my debt to society, and now I'm ready to reclaim my life. Why is everyone treating me like a pariah?" Samantha hesitated, her expression shifting to one of genuine concern. "Karen, you have to understand. What you did, breaking into the bakery and stealing those cupcakes, it was a big deal. The whole town is still reeling from the scandal. People just need some time to adjust." The realization dawned on Karen like a heavy weight crushing her chest. The once adoring community she had taken for granted now viewed her as a social pariah, a stain on their otherwise pristine reputation. Her sense of entitlement had blinded her to the consequences of her actions, and now she was facing the bitter reckoning. As Samantha slowly closed the door, Karen felt her world crumbling around her. The sweet dream of a hero's homecoming had turned to ash, leaving her to confront the harsh reality of her own downfall. Reeling from the cold reception she had received from her once loyal friend Samantha, Karen retreated to the sanctuary of her own home, determined to find solace in the familiar comforts of her past life. However, the moment she stepped through the front door, she was met with another unwelcome surprise. Her husband, Michael, was seated in the living room, his face a portrait of grim determination. "Karen, we need to talk," he said, his voice stern and unyielding. Karen felt her heart sink, a sinking feeling of dread settling in the pit of her stomach. Clearly, the news of her incarceration had reached even the innermost circles of her life. Talk? About what, darling? She replied, feigning nonchalance as she tried to sidestep the impending confrontation. But Michael was having none of it. He rose from his chair, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. About your little escapade at the bakery, Karen. About how you broke the law and brought shame to this family. Karen recoiled, her eyes widening in shock. Shame? Michael, you don't understand. I was trying to save those poor cupcakes. They were all alone, and I couldn't bear the thought of them going to waste. Her husband's expression darkened, and Karen knew in that moment that her excuses would fall on deaf ears. Save the cupcakes. Karen, you broke into a private business and stole their property. You were arrested and convicted. That's not saving. That's theft. But I had to do something. Karen cried, her voice cracking with desperation. Those cupcakes were in danger, and I was the only one who could help them. Michael shook his head, his face a mask of disappointment. That's the problem, Karen. You always think you know what's best, even when it means disregarding the law and hurting others. Well, this time, your actions have consequences, and I'm not sure I can stand by and watch you make a mockery of our family. Karen felt the blood drain from her face, her world crumbling around her. What are you saying, Michael? You can't possibly be. You wouldn't. I'm saying that I'm filing for divorce, Karen, Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't be with someone who has such a blatant disregard for the rules and the people around them. It's over. As the words sank in, Karen felt her knees buckle, and she sank to the floor, her whole body trembling with a mix of shock and anguish. The one person she had counted on to stand by her through thick and thin had just betrayed her, leaving her utterly alone and adrift. The bitter taste of her own actions had never been more pronounced, and Karen knew that she had no one to blame but herself. The cupcakes she had tried so desperately to save had cost her everything, and the realization was a bitter pill to swallow. As the dust settled on the crumbling ruins of her once perfect life, Karen found herself at a crossroads. The betrayal of her husband's divorce filing had shaken her to the core, shattering the illusion of control and stability she had so desperately clung to. Alone and without a support system, Karen was forced to confront the harsh reality of her actions. The once adoring community that had once lavished her with praise and admiration now viewed her with disdain, casting her out as a pariah. Desperate to reclaim her former status, Karen tried time and time again to reconnect with her friends and neighbors, only to be met with the same cold indifference. The very people she had once considered loyal confidants now refused to even acknowledge her existence, leaving her feeling utterly isolated and alone. It was in the depths of this despair that Karen finally began to truly reflect on the consequences of her misguided crusade to save the cupcakes. The broken glass, the stolen goods, the tarnished reputation. All of it was the result of her own sense of entitlement and disregard for the rules that governed the rest of society. As she sat alone in her once vibrant home, the silence deafening, Karen realized that the cupcakes she had so desperately fought to protect were the least of her concerns. The true cost of her actions had been the loss of everything she had once held dear, her freedom, her reputation, and now, even her marriage. The bitter realization that her own choices had led her down this path of self-destruction was a heavy burden to bear. Karen had always seen herself as the hero, the champion of the abandoned cupcakes, but in the end, she was nothing more than a common criminal, a victim of her own misguided sense of righteousness. With nowhere left to turn, Karen found herself sinking deeper into a spiral of depression and self-loathing. The once confident and self-assured woman had been reduced to a mere shadow of her former self, haunted by the consequences of her actions and the cruel indifference of those around her. It was in this moment of reckoning that Karen finally understood the true weight of her mistakes. The sweet fantasy of heroism had turned bitterly sour, leaving her to face the harsh reality of a life shattered by her own sense of entitlement and disregard for the law. As the sun set on another day, Karen sat alone in the growing darkness, the realization dawning on her that the only way to move forward was to confront the bitter truth head-on and begin the long, arduous process of rebuilding her life, one shattered piece at a time. After the devastating fallout from her disastrous Cupcake rescue mission, Karen found herself at a crossroads, forced to confront the bitter reality of her actions and the consequences that had shattered her once perfect life. Stripped of her freedom, her reputation, and even the love of her husband, Karen had been forced to face the harsh truth. Her sense of entitlement and disregard for the law had led her down a path of self-destruction, leaving her utterly alone and adrift. As she sat in the empty silence of her once vibrant home, the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her like a physical burden, Karen knew that the only way to move forward was to take responsibility for her actions and begin the arduous process of rebuilding her life. It was a daunting task, one that would require her to confront the bitter truths she had so desperately tried to avoid. But Karen was determined, driven by a newfound sense of humility and a deep desire to make amends for the pain she had caused. With a renewed sense of purpose, Karen began reaching out to those she had hurt the most, the owners of the Buttercream Bliss Bakery, her former friends and neighbors, and even her estranged husband. One by one, she apologized, acknowledging the gravity of her mistakes and the harm she had done. To her surprise, many of those she had wronged were willing to listen, their expressions softening as they witnessed her genuine remorse and her commitment to making things right. The bakery owners, in particular, were touched by her sincerity, and they even offered her a job, recognizing her passion for baking and her potential for redemption. As Karen poured her heart and soul into her work, she found a sense of purpose and healing that she had never experienced before. Gone was the entitled, self-righteous woman who had once believed she was above the law. In her place stood a humbled, compassionate individual, driven to make amends and rebuild the trust she had so carelessly shattered. Slowly but surely, Karen's reputation began to mend, and her relationships with her family and friends started to heal. The once cold indifference gave way to cautious acceptance, and eventually, genuine forgiveness as those around her witnessed her genuine transformation. It was a long, arduous journey, filled with setbacks and moments of doubt, but Karen never wavered in her determination to make things right. And in the end, her perseverance paid off, as she found herself surrounded by a community that had once rejected her, now embracing her as a testament to the power of redemption and the strength of the human spirit. As she stood behind the counter of the Buttercream Bliss Bakery, surrounded by the familiar sense of freshly baked pastries, Karen couldn't help but smile. The bitter memories of her past had been transformed into a sweet, redemptive story, one that served as a reminder that even the most misguided actions can be redeemed through humility, hard work, and a genuine desire to make amends.